Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I don't know what I was thinking when I got dressed this morning, guys, so I want to apologize. Obviously, I have like my swimsuit tan lines here. I'm wearing this like little set, which let me just show you because then maybe it'll make more sense, but it's like a little pant set. Let me scoot back. Here you go, you can see. It's like a pant set with a little like tube top. But I didn't realize that, okay, Annie, this outfit looks great and all, but when you sit down and record, which is here up, you're either going to look naked or you're going to look weird with your tan line. So if it's distracting, I apologize. Now, talking about today's case, we have talked about a lot of cases together, right? Serial killers, parent killers, children killers, friend killers, all the things. And I feel like the serial killer ones, especially some of like the twisty ones, are enough to make you lose sleep. For me, I know, especially even, and I know he hasn't been convicted yet, Brian Koberger, that's a case where I legitimately lost sleep over it. I was locking all my doors. I was scared at night. A lot of those cases are like that. You hear of this horrific serial killer on the loose or who has been caught, and it just terrifies you. But imagine taking it one step further and imagine it not just being a singular serial killer, but a group of serial killers who are working together in tandem, almost like some sick little like club. That's the case we're talking about today. It's disgusting. There is a lot to talk about. You're going to be with me for a while, so get comfy. You know we like to do our deep dive, so we are going into the trenches and talking about everything, but it is not one for the faint of heart. So gear up, get comfy, do whatever you need to do to get in the right place for this, and we're gonna jump right in. Hey guys, okay, have you heard about Midas Merge? It is this like super cute and unique merge game where you get to discover and nurture these adorable little creatures while you're restoring beautiful fantasy gardens. I've mentioned this game to you guys before and I am so excited to mention it again. I mean, think about this. Combining plants, gems, coins, all trying to bring life back to the land. And get this, the game was made by the same team behind The Sims 3 and Sims 4, so you know that it's gonna have that exact same level of creativity and fun. Now, what's even cooler about all of this is that Midas Merge has a whole narrative behind it. You're on this journey with King Midas and Queen Laia to restore the Gardens of Gold, which were cast in the shadow by the bad guy, Nyx, the goddess of night, and you're basically trying to restore the gardens. So as you merge and unlock new parts of the garden, you also uncover the mystery behind Nyx's revenge. It's like so immersive, it's so fascinating. She'll like pop out at times where you don't expect it and kind of spook you a little bit. It is definitely super fun. Now, gameplay-wise, you're matching items, hatching eggs, and evolving creatures to make your garden thrive. And there are over 200 creatures to collect. Now, my personal favorite is the Cappy Bird, which is a flying capybara that evolves into something even more epic the more that you merge it. Now, you can play this either offline or online, whatever is perfect for you, which I feel like is just so relaxing, whether you're on the go or you're like me and you're just like winding down and you want to pull it up while you're on the couch. And get ready for a thrilling adventure in Midas Merge's haunted garden this Halloween. Explore a spooky new realm filled with enchanting creatures, mysterious treasures, and jack-o'-lantern plants. As you progress, you'll discover rare Halloween items and unlock adorable yet eerie creatures that you can bring back to your Sapphire Sanctuary. And the first 100 players to reach level 10 through the influencer link will receive exclusive Halloween creatures. So if you're looking for a game that combines a fun story, cute creatures, and a totally like flawless, beautiful design, Midas Merge is totally worth checking out. Discover your next favorite game. Merge, restore, and heal the Golden Garden. Download Midas Merge for free via the link in my description or the QR code on the screen. All right, guys, I gotta finish playing. John Justin Bunting was born in Queensland, Australia in 1966, and interestingly, he was born without a sense of smell. I don't have half of a sense of smell. I wasn't born that way. When I had brain surgery, they had to clip half of it, but it is interesting because it like changes your taste buds, everything. But anyway, he was born without a sense of smell. Besides that though, his childhood did seem pretty typical. However, there was one event that shaped the course of John's entire life. Because when he was about 8 years old, a friend's older brother beat him and sexually assaulted him. That event, as I'm sure you can imagine, changed him. He felt this deep, deep, deep-rooted hatred for predators. And he also decided that gay people and those kinds of offenders were the same thing, like one and the same. If you're gay, you must be an offender, things like that. He just hated both of them. Now, over time, John took his hatred to the next level, and he started to punish anyone or anything that he could. He turned to violence, and as a young man, he began killing animals. I mean, first it started with something small like ants, but then it grew to cats and dogs. He even ended up getting a job as an abattoir, which I probably am saying that wrong, but it's basically a slaughterhouse, and he loved it there. He actually told people he loved killing animals. Huge red flag, right? Now, when he was 23 years old, he met his first wife, Veronica Tripp, who was only 18 years old when they got married. They eventually moved to Salisbury North, which is a suburb of Adelaide, Australia. Now, as he got older, John's hatred for offenders, for gay people, it just grew and grew and grew, almost like it was like festering. He ended up even creating a rock spider wall in his home, which rock spider is an Australian slang term for an adult who targets children. So this wall was a way for John to track the people that he suspected were either gay or predators. Remember, he didn't distinguish between them. He mostly used rumors and his own opinions to determine who went on his wall, so there definitely were some innocent people on there as well. But anyway, this wall was basically a conspiracy theorist's dream. It had names of people that John thought were predators. It had like this wool yarn connecting all of them. Think like a makeshift detective board. And John would often call and threaten these people. So in 1991, John ended up becoming friends with somebody named Robert Joe Wagner, a 20-year-old who lived right next door in Salisbury North. Robert was actually a gay man who was living with his partner Barry Lane at the time. And Barry also went by the name Vanessa. Now here's the first point of this case, guys, that a lot of people disagree on, so I just want to talk about it. But some sources claim that Barry was transgender and lived as Vanessa, who, goes and went by that name. These sources use she and her as Vanessa's pronouns. But then other sources claim that Barry only occasionally lived as Vanessa, and that they went back to Barry frequently, so he was more like a cross-dresser rather than an actual trans person. It's hard to know how Barry truly did identify, especially in the 1990s. So for the sake of just following the story, I'm going to refer to him as Barry since that's how he most often seemed to be present. Now anyways, John's friendship with these neighbors of his, it was pretty crazy when you think about it. I mean, considering how he felt about gay people, right? Here was an openly gay couple who became his friends. However, John had a reason for this friendship, because Barry was actually a convicted offender on the registry. He had met Robert when Robert was just 13 years old and had groomed him to be in a relationship. So John felt almost like a kinship with Robert since he had also been harmed that way as a child. And while he despised Barry on principle, Barry was also a helpful source on the local community. It meant that John could add to his, rock spider wall, and he wanted information. So John made an exception for his two neighbors. It was a strange friendship, but it seemed to work for him. Then Robert and Barry introduced John to another man, Clinton Trezise. Now, Clinton was an ex-partner of Barry's, and for whatever reason, John decided that Clinton was actually a predator. Clinton was only 18 years old, so he was actually probably a victim of Barry's, given that he would have been a minor when they had been together. He also seemed to have lived a pretty difficult life. Clinton was openly gay, but he didn't have many friends or family members, and he kept mostly to himself. He had grown up in the foster care system, and he was living on his own when he met John. Clinton was thin, he had brown hair, dark eyes, a little gap in his front teeth, and he was also known as Happy Pants to John because he often wore these bright colored pants, which were his most recognizable trait. People thought that he seemed shy, but he did have some friends, and one of the people that he counted as a friend was John. So John invited Clinton over in August of 1992. It was supposed to just be a friendly and casual visit, but John decided to kill Clinton for his supposed crime of being a predator. Again, there's no evidence to support that, But John was convinced, and after inviting Clinton inside, he attacked him with either a shovel or a hammer. The injuries on Clinton's body showed that he tried to defend himself, but John had the upper hand, and he beat Clinton to death. Afterward, John needed to get rid of the body, and he knew just who to recruit to help him: his two neighbors, Robert and Barry. He forced the two of them to help him take Clinton's body to his car and then go and find a place to dispose of him. So they drove Clinton's body to an area in another town about 25 minutes away. They dug a shallow grave, and they buried him. And even though Clinton had some friends and family, his disappearance wasn't noticed right away. His body wasn't even found until 1994, 2 years later. Now, the important thing to remember here is that John had managed to kill someone that he had decided was a predator. And at this point, he got away with it. But obviously, the murder and the cover-up deeply upset Barry, who ended up telling his mom about what John had done. He also told Veronica, John's wife. Barry begged both of them to stay quiet because he was afraid that if they talked, he would be in danger as well. But Veronica was curious, and she asked John about it. And when she did, he admitted he had committed the murder. But he also demanded that Veronica keep his secret, and she did. See, John could be very convincing and persuasive when he wanted to be. He seemed to be able to read people well and tended to gravitate towards people who he could dominate or easily manipulate. People younger than him were a popular target, as you'll see as we continue. And for example, he had married Veronica when she was just 18 years old. She was also intellectually disabled, which means she was very easy for him to control. When John would tell her to stay quiet, she listened. And while John was never violent to her, she had seen enough of his temper to be frightened, and she was willing to stay quiet to be safe. John also had a way with women, and along that way, he met someone named Elizabeth Harvey. Elizabeth was raising her 4 sons, and she was also another survivor of childhood abuse. Plus, one of her former partners had supposedly sexually harmed at least 2 of her sons when they were younger. Luckily, he was no longer an issue. He had passed away before Elizabeth moved to Salisbury North when all of this was happening and when she met John, which I know we've talked about a lot of different people already and mentioned a lot of different pedos and predators a bunch of times, and you might be wondering like, whoa, what's in the water? Why are there so many predators in this area? Well, Salisbury North at the time was a lower income housing area. So a bunch of people who were convicted offenders and criminals who probably struggled to get a job with their record, they ended up living in this area. The cost of living was pretty low. So that's how Elizabeth's family ended up there as well. She was addicted to shopping and gambling. Money was often a struggle, even when she was working and bringing in an income. So then she moves there, and once they started seeing each other, John became a big part of Elizabeth's life. He even became a father figure to her sons. And let's just say John wasn't only interested in Elizabeth romantically. She was another source for him to start adding people to his rock spider wall. For example, Barry, that neighbor of John's, believed that Elizabeth's children were spending time with a local offender. And unfortunately, he was right. The guy had pretended to be a family friend and ended up hurting 2 of Elizabeth's children, including her oldest son, Jamie. So after Barry warned Elizabeth, she had this guy arrested. But she hated that her children had endured that kind of harm. So when John eventually heard of the situation, he came to Elizabeth to warn her too, but warn her about Barry, who, if you remember, was also a convicted offender. And I know, I told you guys, this story is crazy and it intersects a lot. Now, Elizabeth really appreciated John's concern, and he kind of turned on the charm with her. So the two of them started dating while he was still married to Veronica. Now, I'm sure it's no surprise given the cheating, but John and Veronica's marriage had crumbled by this time. So they divorced around 1994, and John started to spend more time with Elizabeth and her children instead. Some sources claim that Elizabeth and John got married, while other people say it was more like a common law type of marriage, so it's hard to say for sure. I do know that Elizabeth's second oldest son, Jamie, became very close with John. For Jamie, as somebody who had already survived an attack of sexual nature, he considered it a good thing that John openly hated gay men and predators. And given Jamie's history, John's attitudes actually made him feel safe. It also meant that it was easy for John to manipulate Jamie, which is very, very sad, because Jamie went to John because he wanted a father figure to take care of him and value him as a person. But instead, John treated Jamie like a tool to use in his scheme for predators and murdering, because John was wanting to kill again. It had now been 3 years since Clinton's murder, and John hadn't gotten caught or faced any sort of negative consequences, none whatsoever. So he started looking for someone that he considered a predator, somebody who deserved to die, according to him. And given where he lived, he didn't need to look far. The man in question was named Ray Davies, and he was 26 years old. Ray was also an intellectually disabled man. He had thick black hair, a bushy beard, and like almost everyone in this case, he had a very difficult childhood. At 20, he had been convicted of stealing and assault, and now he lived with whoever would take him in, including John's neighbors, Barry and Robert. Now, at one point, Barry introduced Ray to someone named Sue Allen, who was an older woman who lived nearby. Sue dated Ray for a while, and they got engaged, but they broke up because Ray would sleep with other people, including men. Still, the two of them got along, and Sue allowed Ray to live in his mobile home on her property even after they broke up, but it just wasn't a match made in heaven. But even that situation, the cordial friendship, the living arrangements, that came to an end when Sue learned that Ray had been accused of harming 2 young boys. And some reports even claim that these boys were her grandsons, but it's hard to say for sure. I do know that the 2 children were close to her in some way, and she told Ray, you can't stay on my property. Get out of here. You gotta go. I also want to note that these accusations were made against Ray, but they were never proven. He might not have actually hurt those boys, or maybe he did. All we have to go off of is a rumor. Now, I want to take a quick pause in the story, and I also want to say I know I've already thrown out a ton of names at you, between John, his friends, his significant others, the people he suspected of harming children, so I want to just take a step back and take a look at the big picture. At this point, John was friends with his neighbors, Robert and Barry. He was also dating both Elizabeth and this woman, Sue, that we just talked about. It's likely that Sue told John what was going on with Ray when she kicked him off her property, because remember, he was a suspected predator, which now meant that John was in close proximity to another person that he believed was an offender. So John came up with a plan to take care of Ray. On Christmas Day in 1995, John and his neighbor Robert broke into Ray's trailer, and they shoved him into the trunk of their car. Then they drove him to the house where Elizabeth and her kids lived. They were gone for the holidays, so John and Robert had total privacy while they dragged Ray into the bedroom. They tied him up, threw him into the tub, and then they beat him around his groin and his thighs with a metal pipe. After they were done beating him, they then put him in the back of the trunk. Then they drove him back to John's house, and they saw Elizabeth there, which, yes, you heard that right. She wasn't at her own home because she was supposed to have other plans for Christmas, but now she was alone at John's house. I don't know why. Again, the information that's available is pretty tricky to sort through. But I do know that John offered Ray to Elizabeth as a present, which is really, really twisted, right? Ray had not been convicted of any of the crimes that he had been accused of, and he hadn't hurt Elizabeth at all. Remember, the alleged victims were close to Sue, not her. Elizabeth had nothing to do with any of this, so I don't know why John would even think that she would want this, quote-unquote present from him. Maybe it was because her own boys had been harmed and she wanted to retaliate and get her anger out on somebody who also was an alleged predator. I don't know. But at John's urging, she helped the 2 men strangle Ray to death with jumper cables. And I've seen some reports that Elizabeth also stabbed Ray, but again, sources differ. Whatever happened, after hours of being beaten and driven around in the trunk of a car, Ray died at John's house. And now John had another body that he needed to get rid of. But rather than driving to another town and burying Ray's body like what he had done with Clinton all of those years earlier, John and Robert decided to bury him in John's yard. And it's shocking to me that he would bury a body on his own property, but apparently John had already been digging a hole so that he could build a secret room of sorts. So now he repurposed that hole, using it as a grave instead. He threw in some concrete, some other building materials to cover it up, and that was that. Then Robert and John told some people that they had hurt and threatened Ray and left him in the wilderness. They said that he was alive, but that he was too scared to come back. Nobody questioned it, and because of that, nobody reported Ray as missing. And I think that really speaks to how good John was at manipulating everybody around him. He pretty much admitted that he had hurt this man who disappeared, and people were kind of basically like, okay, no need to call the police or feel suspicious about anything, no red flag. And here's another sign of John's skill with manipulation. In 1996, he broke up with Sue. And you'll remember Sue was the person who first told John that she thought that Ray was a predator. So she had to see the connection there. I mean, how Ray went missing right after John heard the rumors about him, and you would think that she'd be pissed at John after their breakup and maybe go to the police, tell them everything she knew. But that's not what happened. It was actually basically the opposite. She tried to win John back and threw herself at him multiple times over the next few months. John thought that her behavior was annoying, and basically, the harder she tried to make John fall for her again, the less he liked her. But then finally, at some point in November of 1996, Sue went missing. Her brother reported it to the police, but they weren't sure that anything had actually happened to her. Even though Sue's friends and family hadn't seen her for a while, someone was still collecting her government pension. Well, somehow the police tracked down the person who had been cashing Sue's checks. And surprise, surprise, who do you think it was? It was John. He told them that Sue had left the area to get away from her family, and now she was out living with a new boyfriend. John was just cashing her pension checks for her, as a favor, getting the money and then passing it along to her, basically. And as much as that sounds like a super obvious lie, the police believed him. Now, in reality, I'm sure you figured this out already, but Sue was dead. And it seems pretty likely that John is the one that killed her, although I'll just spoil it right now, that has not been proven. From what I can tell, John probably killed Sue because he was sick of her begging him to take her back. Maybe she did at one point threaten to out him, to tell on him. But he got something else out of the murder, besides just getting rid of an ex that he didn't want to see anymore. He also made money off of his crime. Because he got those pension checks, he started selling a bunch of her valuables that she had owned, so he was now profiting off of it. And again, he got away with it. Which meant in John's mind, there was no reason not to keep on killing. He kept getting away with things. He was now up to 3 people he had killed. And he got another opportunity in 1996, although I'm not sure the exact date. That's when Robert and Barry broke up, and Robert moved in with John and Elizabeth for a little bit, all while he was trying to figure out what to do with his life now that he was single again. And it's worth mentioning that by this time, Robert was pretty much completely under John's thumb. But remember, John hated gay people, so Robert suddenly started telling people that he was not actually gay. He identified as straight from that point on. And if anybody ever went like, well, wait, weren't you in a relationship with a man named Barry for literally years? Robert would just refuse to talk about it. He would shut the conversation down, like his romantic past was just completely unmentionable. Robert even went on to date a woman and get engaged. One of his fiance's friends was a 19-year-old trans woman named Michelle, and like everybody in this story, she also had a horrible childhood. She had grown up in foster care until she ran away, living with family or friends as she got older. She had reddish hair, light-colored eyes, a big smile. But the problem was, Robert hated Michelle. I'm not sure why, but if I had to guess, it might have had something to do with his good buddy John, who had convinced him to hate gay people. Not that all trans people are gay necessarily, but Michelle did identify as a gay man for a while before she then transitioned. Whatever Robert's reasons were, he struggled to accept that Michelle was friends with his fiancée, and also that she was involved in her children's lives. He also refused to accept Michelle's identity. He acted like she was just this gay man who was pretending to be a woman. Now, Michelle was good with kids, and she babysat and played with them pretty frequently. So Robert didn't really feel like he could actually convince his fiancée to just cut her out of their lives. He just kind of had to accept that Michelle was going to be around. But he eventually couldn't take it anymore. So he went to John to tell him that Michelle should be their next victim. Sometime in September of 1997, Robert and John kidnapped Michelle and then took her to a shed in Murray Beach, which is where John was living with Elizabeth. Then they beat and tortured Michelle with cigarettes before tying a noose around her neck. There are different reports on what they did next, but one source claims that they strangled Michelle until she passed out, then woke her up, strangled her again, and just kind of repeated the cycle over and over. Another source says that they put that noose on a beam so that when Michelle passed out from the pain and from the exhaustion, she ended up strangling herself. Whatever the case, it was horrible and an extended form of torture that eventually killed Michelle. And again, truly, I can't emphasize this enough, Michelle had not hurt anyone. There were not even allegations against her. It was this brutal, sadistic killing that happened for no reason except for that John and Robert hated her and wanted to hurt somebody. And then they had to figure out how to get rid of her. So they put Michelle's body in a barrel and they left it in that shed where she had died. Now, Michelle had a roommate, but she had been away for a few days, and the murders happened while she wasn't home. So when she got back, Michelle was gone and pretty much all of the things that they owned were missing. So John and Robert had told her that Michelle had stolen her things to pay for her gender confirmation surgery. The roommate didn't necessarily believe their story, but John and Robert were convincing. So she figured it probably wasn't anything serious and Michelle was probably fine wherever she was. It sounds like John or Robert even called her at one point and pretended to be Michelle, saying she was leaving, not to call the cops, not to worry about her, and never contact her again. And just like with Sue, nothing really happened. People believed John, the master manipulator, and Michelle's disappearance was just accepted as one of those things that happened. And the more that they got away with these murders, the bolder Robert and John felt. So it was only a matter of time, as I'm sure you can imagine, before they found a new victim. Now, by this time, Robert's ex-boyfriend, Barry, had a new partner, an 18-year-old named Thomas. Thomas had a little baby face with straight hair, dark eyes, also a big smile. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he struggled a lot with his mental health. There was certainly a power difference between him and 42-year-old Barry, but Thomas knew John and Robert because they were still friends with Barry. And after 5 months, when Thomas wanted out of the relationship, he told John and Robert that Barry had groomed him, and also that he had sexually harmed him. He confided in them that he needed their help to make sure that Barry would leave him alone after the breakup. So even though John had been friends with Barry before, and Robert used to date him, they didn't like that Barry had known that they had killed that first victim, Clinton. I mean, he could turn them over to the cops at any moment. He also might have known about Ray and Sue, but I'm not sure. So either way, they figured that it was in their own best interest to get rid of Barry. Even before Thomas came along asking for their help, they had decided they needed to get rid of Barry. So in October of 1997, Thomas let John and Robert into the house that he still shared with Barry. Barry was in bed when the men attacked him and put handcuffs on him. Once he was handcuffed and couldn't get away or couldn't fight back, the killers made Barry call his mom and yell horrible, horrible things at her, saying he never wanted to see her again. Things like that. They also made him call his sister and say that he was going to be leaving town for a while. Then, after Barry was done on the phone, they tortured him until he told them his baking information. They crushed Barry's toes with pliers, they took turns beating him, and they eventually strangled him to death. And afterward, they dismembered Barry, and they put his body into that same barrel that Michelle's body was in. It is just insane. Now, my guess is that the guys made Barry make all of those calls so that nobody would report him as missing, right? They probably hoped that Barry's mom and sister would just assume that he freaked out, left town, and let things kind of just lie there. I mean, after all, they had already manipulated people into not reporting the other victims' disappearances. But Barry's family wasn't so easy to trick. They reported him missing, except the cops could not figure out what had happened to him. And it's just so amazing to me how John and Robert just kept getting away with it. In 1997, Australia's Most Wanted actually aired 2 episodes about John's first victim, Clinton. John watched both episodes with Elizabeth's son, Jamie, and even told Jamie that the disappearance was, quote, his handiwork. He also said that Clinton was dirty. That was his code word for a predator who went after children, and he said he had taken care of him because of that. Now, Jamie probably didn't know what to think at that point, but I think that he believed him. I mean, after all, John had brought him along as he had killed and skinned cats and dogs in the neighborhood in the past. He had also known John long enough to see, just how passionately he hated people that he thought were predators. So Jamie started telling other people, including one of his stepbrothers. He told him John admitted to killing somebody and getting away with it. But people didn't really believe him, though, because Jamie was struggling with a heroin addiction, so he wasn't considered a reliable source. Meanwhile, Robert and John were only getting bolder. They sort of now took Thomas under their wings after they had all killed Barry, and Thomas moved in with Robert, and Robert started teaching him everything he knew, so it definitely wasn't a good situation, especially when you remember that Thomas had already had some very serious mental health problems even before all of this, and now the stress was getting to him. So at the beginning of November, he took a knife and he chased a dog around trying to kill it. You would think that John wouldn't have an issue with that because he also had killed dogs, but John thought that it was a sign that Thomas was becoming too unstable to be trusted. So the next day, on November 5th, John and Robert took Thomas to an isolated area and they used a noose to strangle him. Then they staged his body to look like he took his own life. And get this, nobody questioned it. He had a history of making attempts on his own life, and people just assumed that this time he was successful. So I don't even know where we are at with victim count. I think we're at 5 now, right? We had Clinton, Sue, we had Barry, Thomas. I know I'm forgetting somebody else there. Ray. I mean, this is bananas. Now, it didn't stop. John's next victim, more or less, kind of just fell into his lap by accident this time. Like I mentioned before, John was a father figure to Elizabeth's son Jamie, and Jamie was abusing heroin. Well, Jamie also had a friend named Gavin who struggled with the addiction as well. And when things got really bad for Jamie and he couldn't handle living on his own anymore, he moved in with John and Elizabeth, and Gavin came with him. Now, Gavin was a well-built man with straight dark hair and dark eyes. And like most people in this story, he struggled with his mental health. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He had been in and out of mental facilities and was also grieving his mother's death when he moved in with Jamie at that time. So that's a lot for anybody to deal with. But as you can imagine, John had no sympathy for Gavin. He thought he was weak. John also hated people who didn't have jobs and didn't contribute to society, which I gotta say was pretty hypocritical, because at this time John didn't have a job, and the only way that he made any money was from killing people and then stealing from them. Now, of course, John was hardly the first serial killer who held everyone else to different standards than he had for himself, but in his mind, it made perfect sense that Gavin just had to die. So Robert and John attacked Gavin in April of 1998 while he was asleep in his car on John's property. He managed to fight back and even stabbed John in the hand with a screwdriver before John and Robert ended up overpowering him. And just like with all the other murders, they strangled him and then chopped him up, put him in a barrel, and left him inside that shed. However, this time around, John also did something a little bit different. Before he put Gavin inside that barrel, John showed his body to Jamie. He also showed him the decaying remains of Michelle and Barry as well. All 3 of those bodies were still inside that shed together. Now, Jamie had heard John talk about killing people before, but now seeing all of these people dead in his stepfather's shed, including his friend, and seeing this with his own 2 eyes, it was terrifying. And Jamie realized the truth. There was no guarantee that John wouldn't kill him as well if he didn't fall in line. So afterward, John had Jamie use Gavin's card to steal his money. And you might think that it would make it more likely that John and Jamie were going to get caught. However, since Gavin was somebody who struggled with his mental health and with addiction, people did not seem surprised when he disappeared. When Jamie told everyone that he had left town, they just accepted it as probably true. Now, it sucks that Jamie was now helping John and Robert get away with murder, but I also don't blame him about being nervous for his own safety. I mean, he's seeing this havoc and this, barbaric behavior with his own 2 eyes. Also, I wouldn't blame him for worrying about his own safety even as his stepson, because John's next victim was somebody who was very close to home. It was John's oldest stepson, and also Jamie's half-brother, Troy. Jamie had told John that Troy had, taken advantage of him in a sexual way when he was younger. So now John decided it was time for Troy to pay. So one night in August of 1998, when Elizabeth and the 2 younger boys were out of the house, John came to Jamie's room and woke him up. He was there with Robert and John's friend from work, a guy named Mark, and I'm not entirely sure what John said to get this random coworker to agree to help with this attack, but I do know that John told Jamie that they were just going to rough Troy up. They weren't going to kill him. They just wanted to, teach him a lesson. And he told Mark the same thing. Except then, they all went into Troy's room and they beat him. Badly. It went way beyond just roughing someone up. Jamie was terrified, and he could only watch as John and Robert beat Troy. As for Mark, he panicked completely and left the room, although he did stay in the house. So then John told Jamie to handcuff Troy, and they took him to the bathtub, where there they tortured and beat him more. According to Jamie, he didn't want to participate, but he kept getting dragged into the attack by John. John also told Troy to call him Lord Sir, and to call Robert God, and to call Jamie Master. Then, like they had done with their other victims, they hit him in the groin as punishment for his alleged sexual crimes. They used pliers on his toes, just like they had done with Barry, and then John got out a tape recorder and forced Troy to record messages telling his mom he was leaving, and he didn't want her to come look for him. "Stay out of my life. I'm leaving. Don't come after me. Leave me alone." So finally, like with all of the other victims, they gagged and strangled Troy in the bathtub. It's possible that Jamie helped strangle him, but I'm not entirely sure. I do know that at some point, Mark rejoined the rest of the group, and all 4 men loaded Troy's body into a barrel. And when he wouldn't fit, John cut off his feet and then closed the lid. Now you might be thinking, how's John going to explain that to Elizabeth, his partner? Well, he and Jamie said that there had been a big fight and that Troy had run off, so his absence was again chalked up to just personal difficulties. And Jamie backed up everything John said because he now knew for sure if John could kill Troy, he certainly could kill Jamie too. In the meantime, John got his new bestest buddy from work, Mark, to agree to store these barrels in his home. Mark lived with his wife, her children, and his sister-in-law, Jody, at the time, but he agreed to do it. Now, I know we've already covered so many people in this case, and it's a lot of names to keep track of, but here's what you need to know about Jody. Around this time, she too began dating John, even though he was still in a relationship with Elizabeth. And he just told Elizabeth that he had gotten a new job to explain all of the hours that he was spending away from home. Jody also had a son who lived with her named Fred. He had dark hair, bright blue eyes, and he spent some of his life in foster care, which was very, very rough. John got to know Fred while he was dating Jody, and like so many others, he became absolutely certain that Fred was a predator. He specifically thought that Fred targeted little girls. There is no evidence of that, though, whatsoever. It just didn't happen. John was just making things up. In reality, Fred was focused on getting through school, and he wanted to join the Air Force. He was excited about leaving his bad home life behind and embracing his future. But that didn't stop John. In September of 1998, Fred got the good news that he had been accepted into the Air Force. He told his mom that he was going out to celebrate with his friends, and somehow he ended up at John's old house. I'm not sure how exactly, but Robert and John tricked Fred into putting some handcuffs on himself. And then when he did, they forced him into the bathtub. And in a very sick and twisted repeat of Troy's murder, Jamie watched as Robert and John beat Fred badly, especially around his genitals. But their torture went even further, and they stuck lit cigarettes in his ears and up his nose. John had also discovered a new type of torture device, something called a variac. It's a tool that's used for metal work. It was almost like a battery that delivered electrical shocks through alligator clamps, which John put on Fred's genitals. Then he just kept delivering shock after shock after shock. Robert also put the metal end of this sparkler into Fred's urethra, and then he lit it so it burned down to his skin. And when they did that, they then injected water, or in some reports, bleach actually, into his groin and his legs, which, can you even imagine the extreme brutality of all of that? But as we're seeing, it's escalating. Not only are they getting this itch to kill more and find more victims, but their method of killing is just getting more brutal, more brutal, more brutal, and it is just such a clear indication of escalation. Now, like with the other victims, John and Robert recorded Fred saying he was leaving, that he hated his mom, he didn't want her in her life. They also, of course, got his bank information. And the torture lasted for however long John and Robert could draw it out. It's unclear how exactly Fred died, but the evidence points to him suffocating on the gag that John and Robert had used to keep him from screaming, which my heart just breaks for Fred, who suffered so incredibly much. It is absolutely sickening. They ended up taking Fred's body back to Mark's house, who, remember, Mark lived with Fred's mother, Jody, and they left him on the floor, in bags, all while they went and grabbed another barrel. Now, Jody noticed that he was missing, of course, and tried to call different friends to find him, but nobody could tell her what had really happened. Her tortured and murdered son was literally in the garage of the same home where she lived, but she had no idea. John, a pro by this point, made it look like Fred had just run away. He told Jody that he had seen him alive and well at a service station, and he just wanted to skip town. He wanted to go. However, Jody still reported him missing to the police. But then a few days later, John called the house and played those messages that he had made Fred record, saying he was leaving to leave him alone. So she figured he had run away. And once again, John, Robert, and now Jamie got away with murder. Within just a few weeks of killing Fred, John was already now looking for someone to be his next victim. He had this itch, he needed to scratch it. And even though he was committing murders more frequently, apparently he wasn't ready to cross the line in terms of just killing somebody random. He wanted to feel like these murders were justified some way, like he was punishing bad people, even if that meant he had to make up lies and pretend that these totally innocent people were actually offenders against children. I mean, he needed something, some sort of reason to justify it. In reality, though, most of John's victims had done nothing wrong, and John had no evidence to support his belief that any of them were pedos, offenders, nefarious people, nothing. So was he just good at deceiving himself? Did he think of himself as some kind of vigilante? Why was it so important for him to tell himself that the murders were justified? Well, somehow he focused in on 29-year-old Gary. Gary had dark hair and eyes and a crooked but nice, kind-looking smile. He also was mentally and physically disabled, this after a car accident that left him with brain damage and with a permanent limp. He tended to live on the streets, but by 1998, he found some friends who were willing to let him crash at their house. And it also wasn't too far from where Jamie lived. Well, like we've already heard so many times before, John suspected that Gary was gay, based on absolutely nothing. He just thought that Gary had that vibe, I guess. I don't know. John also thought that Gary looked a lot like Troy, so that was another reason for him to hate him. This is according to John's twisted way of seeing things. So based on all of this nothing, this huge nothing burger, John decided to make Gary his next victim. So John told Jamie, get all the information you can about Gary. Basically, he wanted to know if anybody would miss him. He also wanted to know about Gary's financial situation, where he got his money, what steps John would have to take to get his hands on it, that kind of thing. So Jamie, feeling trapped, did whatever John told him to do. He discovered that Gary did have a pension and also some settlement money from that accident, but he was hardly in a great financial situation. With his disabilities and with some self-medication from drugs and alcohol, he hadn't exactly been able to stick to a budget or save money over the years. And in addition to Gary's physical, mental, and financial difficulties, he was also lonely and could be a little too quick to trust people. He didn't always realize when he was being taken advantage of. So all to say, when John, Robert, and Jamie showed up at Gary's house offering to have a drink, spend some time with him, hang out, be friends, it didn't set off any alarm bells for him. And he let them in. So the group drank for maybe 20 minutes before Robert then attacked Gary. Now he was a smaller man and Robert easily overpowered him. Robert let him go before he passed out, but Gary seemed to be too scared and too in shock to even try to fight back. So they then moved to the kitchen and John got out those same items that they had used to torture Fred. The metal fuse device, the cigarettes. They interrogated Gary, who again was not a predator of any sort. So as Robert and John were, asking him and pressing him about his crimes, what he has done to children, Gary couldn't tell them anything because there was literally nothing to tell. But then, of course, they got his banking information because at this point, I think that was one of the biggest parts for John. He wanted money in all of this, not only the thrill of the kill, but what he could get from it. So Jamie also helped, and he beat Gary up so that John and Robert wouldn't have any sort of reason to doubt his loyalty, but he left before Gary eventually died. It's not clear how, but it was after hours of torture. And then Gary's body, of course, joined the others in a barrel inside Mark's garage. Now, since he was an adult, Gary was not reported as missing. His family did notice his absence, but they didn't want to pry into his life if that's not what he wanted. But at this point, the bodies, they were piling up in Mark's house. Jody and John were still in their relationship, although Jody took it much more seriously. John seemed to just like having somebody to manipulate, having a side piece. He was also still living with Elizabeth and with her son Jamie. He was killing people, getting away with it, getting money from his victims, having affairs. Everything was pretty much working out for him in his mind. But then things hit a snag when Mark confessed to John that he had told his wife about the murders. His wife's name was also Elizabeth, which I know gets confusing since John was also married to a woman named Elizabeth. So to keep things a little clear, I'm just going to keep calling her Mark's wife. Now, it's not clear how many murders Mark even knew about by this time. He had only helped commit one, but there were multiple victims inside barrels in his house. So he had to know that more than one person had been killed. The point is, Mark knew a lot, and now so did his wife. One day between November 20th and November 26th in 1998, Mark took Jody out of the house. So when Mark's wife was still at home, alone, Robert and John attacked her. The specific details of her murder aren't public information, but I do know that she was bound and taken to her own bathroom. There, she was tortured. Somewhere along the way, Robert and John put a gag into her mouth, wrapped duct tape around her head, and she ultimately suffocated to death. Like with the other victims, they took her body into the garage and they left it there until they could find a barrel to put her in. Now later, Mark said that it took a while for him to notice that his wife was dead or missing, and I find that very difficult to believe. Because if Mark was sad about his wife's murder, he definitely didn't show it to anyone, and he immediately helped cover it up. The day after the murder, he started telling people that she had gone out while he was away from the house. Then she came home early in the morning, she was drunk, and then turned around and left with some boyfriend that she had been cheating on him with. Jody, for one, wasn't too surprised when she heard this story because apparently it was something that Mark's wife had done in the past. So Jody accepted this story from Mark and John completely, took it at face value. But the rest of the family wasn't quite so trusting, especially because Mark and John started telling different, contradictory stories about what had happened. John said that Mark's wife had hit on him while they were alone together, and that when he rejected her, she went to her bedroom to sulk. Later on, he learned that she had run off with that boyfriend that she was cheating on Mark with. Mark also gave different answers about what happened at different times. But ultimately, days passed without any word from her, so her brother reported her missing to the police. And Mark repeated his original story. She had left with her boyfriend. The police eventually interviewed John and Robert. John told them this new version of the story that he had given before. Mark's wife had hit on him. Robert walked in, saw it, and then she went to her room for the rest of the night, started sulking. That was all he knew. But the detectives were pretty suspicious at this point, because when they searched the house, they found her purse that had her ID card, her bank cards, everything still inside. Her wedding band and ring were also there too, which was very unusual because she never took them off. So even if she was leaving her husband, you would think she would keep something valuable. Maybe she could pawn it if she ever needed money. And still, she never contacted her siblings, her children, or her husband. On top of all of this, Robert and John were already on the police's radar as well, because you'll remember that their very first victim, Clinton, wasn't found for 2 years after his murder. His remains were recovered in 1994, but the police didn't immediately connect Clinton to John or Robert. However, in 1997, when Barry was reported as missing, the police noticed that he had known Clinton. They had the same social circles, the same friends. And specifically, they both knew John when they went missing. And the police also knew by this time that John had been collecting Sue's pension checks. You'll remember they initially bought John's story about how he was doing that as a favor to Sue, cashing it and then giving her the money. But now they were starting to finally realize how suspicious all of this was. From there, it didn't take much more digging for them to figure out that John knew another missing man, Ray. They also realized that Robert was tied to all of the disappearances and the murders as well. So it doesn't sound like they connected either of them to any of the other disappearances yet. They had killed 7 people, but the police had only put things together for 5 of them. But the real key came when they were searching Mark's house to try and figure out what had happened to his wife. They noticed a horrible odor in the garage. Even though by then the 5 barrels that were holding the bodies had been moved, the odor and the stench was still there. John, Robert, and Mark were smart enough to realize that the police were going to find those barrels during one of the searches. So they had moved 4 of them to a friend's property, and then they left the 5th one in an old car at Jamie's house. But like I said, even though the barrels were gone, the garage, it still reeked of decomposition. And that was a huge red flag to the police, of course. Literally everyone but John had noticed that horrible smell that was coming from the barrels. Because remember, John had no sense of smell. So it never bothered him to have the barrels nearby. Whenever anybody asked why his garage smelled like rotten meat, he would just say he illegally had killed and hunted some kangaroos and he was afraid to throw the bodies away because he might get in trouble. So instead, he said he just kept these carcasses in his garage to rot, which is weird, but apparently it was something that John would do. Well, now John didn't have the barrels in his house anymore, but he couldn't keep them in a car and at a friend's place forever. So instead, he and Mark heard about a local bank in the nearby town of Snowtown, and it was going out of business. So they arranged to rent that building after the bank shut down. Then, John stored all of the barrels that had these bodies in them in the vault. It was the perfect place because the bank was built to protect money, and now it protected John's dirty secret. But even from behind a very secure, very thick bank door, the smell started to seep into the rest of the building. At one point, John and Robert brought Mark and Jamie to the bank with a new plan. They wanted to now dismember the bodies, pour concrete into the barrels to make them super heavy, then dump them into the ocean. But that never happened, because by this time, the police had wiretapped their phones, and they were tailing them when they could. However, they weren't tailing them all the time, unfortunately. John had no idea that the police were closing in on him when he picked out a new victim, Elizabeth's 24-year-old stepson, David. Now, David didn't really like or trust most people in his family. That included John. John assumed that David was gay, pretty much only because David cared about his appearance and made sure he looked nice. He had like shiny brown hair, he parted it down the middle, he dressed well. That was it. So, in John's mind, that meant he was gay because he took care of himself. John knew that David didn't trust him, so he decided he needed to use Jamie in his plan. Jamie told David that he had found an amazing deal on a computer. However, they had to go to Snowtown to get it. David was very interested, so he and Jamie jumped in the car and headed out. Now, at this point, the police knew that John and Robert wanted to kill David because, remember, they had wiretapped their phones. They heard about the plan, and I'm not sure if they were unclear on exactly when the murder was supposed to happen or what went wrong or what happened, but they didn't do anything to stop the killing. And instead, Jamie took David into the bank and they went straight inside where John was standing near a computer. Robert was also hiding somewhere in the bank. And when David got close enough, he jumped out, choked David while Jamie put handcuffs on him. David was, of course, terrified, but John assured him, it's okay, you're going to go home soon. He took his wallet, he asked him for his PIN number, and then he set up a microphone and recorded David saying a whole bunch of words, names, and numbers. I guess he thought that he could splice them together to make whatever message he wanted, which if it wasn't already obvious, John was pretty arrogant, but I think the fact that he thought that this would actually work really drives that idea home. But just to be safe though, John also had David say some phrases that he could definitely use, just like he had with his previous victims. Afterwards, Robert and John stripped and gagged David. Then they beat him up. John demanded that Jamie join in, and he did. Afterward, John sent Robert and Jamie out to go make sure that David's card worked. They went to a local gas station and they tried it, but the card was declined. Apparently, David was out of money. But while Robert and Jamie were gone, David made a last desperate attempt to save his own life. And he kicked John as hard as he could, enough to break his rib. Sadly, though, it wasn't enough. In fact, John flew into a rage because of this, and he used his own belt to strangle David. He pulled the belt so hard that he broke his thumb, and David died in the Snowtown bank. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I think that it was good that David lost his life. Not at all. But John and Robert had some very horrible tortures planned. They would have lasted for hours. So I do think, as horrible as it sounds, that it actually is good that David was spared all of that torture and got a quicker, less painful death. When Robert and Jamie got back, John told Jamie that he'd have to help dispose of the body. John was now too badly hurt to do anything himself. So they put David in a barrel and pushed that barrel into the vault. Afterward, John concocted some story that David had gotten a 13-year-old girl pregnant and had run off with her. He told David's family and friends this story, but they didn't believe it. David's girlfriend, Linda, even told Jamie that if she didn't hear from David soon, she was going to call the police. Jamie was very nervous about that, though, so he called John to tell him that Linda needed to hear David's voice. And since John had recorded all of those words, all of those phrases, he tried to edit together a message that sounded natural. It didn't, obviously, but they did a bunch of different tests to each other to see if it did sound real over the phone, and thanks to those wiretaps, the police heard all of it. Eventually, John and the others realized that this whole plan wasn't working, so they ended up just going with one of those pre-recorded messages that David had made for them, and they used them to make some phone calls to David's loved ones and try to sell that story, but his family didn't buy it. In the meantime, an anonymous tipster called the police and said that John, Mark, and Robert had been stuffing bags and barrels into a car, which had now disappeared. So naturally, the investigators wanted to find this car and see what these men were trying to hide. Another tip took them to a friend's property where the car was parked. The friend said that the car, which still reeked, even without those barrels, belonged to John and Mark. The friend also mentioned that kangaroo story, but the police had pieced together the truth. They knew it wasn't a kangaroo in that barrel, but it was one or more of the missing victims. And somehow this friend knew that John and Robert were now storing all of the barrels in this bank vault. I don't know how he knew, but he told the police. So they got a warrant and they went to the bank on the morning of May 20th, 1999. It didn't take them long to find the 5 barrels with badly decomposed remains of multiple people. Although at that time there was no way to tell who or even how many bodies they had discovered.
Our major crime detectives, in conjunction with a small group of forensic police officers, were able to open the vault where you have decompositions of bodies.
I guess we weren't surprised with what we found, given the smell coming from the place.
John, Robert, and Mark were all arrested the following day, and Jamie was arrested on May 26th. This news coverage on this case absolutely stunned Australia, as I'm sure you can imagine. It was the worst serial killing that the country had ever seen, and people were horrified that these 4 men had managed to kill all of these people without being caught. The story came to be known as both the Bodies in the Barrels murders and the Snowtown murders, even though only one murder actually happened in Snowtown. I guess since that's where the bodies were found, that's the name that everybody associated with the crime though, and that's why it was dubbed that way. Now, Ray and Sue weren't found in the barrels. The police had already linked their disappearances to John and Robert, but they needed the bodies to prove anything. So they searched John's old property, his address, and there they found Ray and Sue's bodies in the backyard.
Detectives were back at 203 Waterloo Corner Road first thing this morning, this time with earth-moving equipment. Just before noon, their suspicions that this northern suburb's backyard was hiding another body were confirmed.
We have found a second body at this location. At this point in time, we're unable to tell the sex or anything about it.
Human bones were found directly underneath those of the female body uncovered on Sunday. It's believed they've been there longer, and this time 3 metres deep. 2 of the state's top police arrived at the scene this afternoon to offer support. They're not ruling out further discoveries.
The number of people that will ultimately appear in court, or indeed the number of deceased people that we uncover, still is yet to be determined.
The cause of death of any of the 10 victims is still not known, but police say one of the 8 Snowtown bodies was immersed in a barrel of hydrochloric acid.
The police also re-examined that apparent self-harming of Thomas. It seemed like too much of a coincidence that he had taken his own life in the middle of this murder spree. So in the end, the police charged John, Robert, Mark, and Jamie with 12 counts of murder. That covered the 8 bodies in the barrels, plus Clinton, Thomas, Ray, and Sue. At first, all 4 men pleaded not guilty. However, in 2002, Jamie changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders and agreed to testify against Robert and John. His testimony is actually why we know so much about the 4 murders, including the ways the victims were tortured before they died. It's hard to say more about the crimes that Jamie personally didn't witness because the bodies were so badly decomposed when they were found, and it was also too hard for a medical examiner to determine much. But since Robert, Mark, and John never admitted to anything, we can't go by their statements, and that's why there's a lot of holes. Jamie was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 26 years. And get this, and if this doesn't send a shiver down your spine, I don't know what does, but that means he could be out next year, in 2025. He has spent at least some of his sentence in isolation, and the authorities never released the name of the prison where he's being kept, and so nobody knows exactly where Jamie is. His picture was also suppressed by the courts, so no one is absolutely certain what Jamie even looks like now. Robert and John's trial started in October of 2002, and it lasted for almost an entire year. It was the longest trial in South Australia's history. Jamie was a key witness for the prosecution, describing the murders that he was present for and the things that John and Robert had told him about the other murders. His mom, Elizabeth, however, couldn't testify because she had died of cancer in 2001. John was found guilty of 11 murders, and Robert was found guilty of 7 because there were 4 murders that John had been charged with and Robert wasn't. The jury ended up deadlocked on Sue's case because her cause of death couldn't be proven. John and Robert probably killed her, but they also argued that she might have died of natural causes. And you might be thinking, how does somebody die of natural causes and end up buried in a serial killer's yard? Well, according to John, he went over to her house one day and found her dead, something of like a heart attack or something else. He couldn't tell because he wasn't a doctor, but instead of calling for an ambulance or involving the police or doing any of the normal things that a reasonable person would do in that situation, he called Robert. So then the two of them dismembered Sue's body and put her in plastic bags before dumping her in the same hole where Ray was buried. Which, okay, not suspicious at all, right? A very normal, innocent way to handle finding your friend dead of natural causes. But for whatever reason, the jury was actually split on whether that story was credible, and they couldn't come to a verdict. The prosecution decided not to retry John or Robert for her possible murder. So John was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the chance of parole, and Robert got 10 life sentences without the chance of parole. Now, in my opinion, that's the exact right sentence because Robert and John need to stay in prison forever. They have never shown remorse, and to this day, they still try to say that the murders were justified because they were just trying to stop offenders from hurting kids. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Most of their victims were not predators, and clearly, money was also a very big factor in this. I think they were just monsters who liked to torture and murder. A year after John and Robert were sentenced, Mark went to trial. He was only charged with 2 murders, those of his wife and Troy, since those were the only ones that he was present for. The jury was also deadlocked on those charges. And get this, the prosecution decided not to retry him. That might be because he was also charged with 6 counts of helping John and Robert cover up their crimes, which he pleaded guilty to, and for that he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, starting from his original arrest in 1999, which, for those of you who are doing the math, that means that his sentence is up. And now Mark is out of prison, yet still under supervision. He was released in the spring of 2024, and as we can all agree on and believe, the families of his victims are devastated by this. They believe that he should stay in prison forever, even though he wasn't found guilty of murder. Mark is now 65 years old, and he has very strict guidelines to follow. He can't contact any of the victims' families, he can't talk to the media, so he won't be profiting off of the crimes. And the Supreme Court of Australia is still determining if they think that he is a high-risk offender, which could land him back in jail. But right now, he's a free man. Jamie will be eligible for parole in May of 2025, when he's 45 years old. I don't know the kind of prisoner he's been or if he even wants to be paroled. He seems to have shown the most remorse out of all of the perpetrators, and he was also just a kid when John came into his life. Not that that makes it okay, but it's entirely possible that John would have killed Jamie if he hadn't helped him. So it feels like he might have been coerced into murder, but that's all according to Jamie, who of course has a motive to make himself look as innocent as possible, and he could have gone for help at any point. There's no excuse for him. But I do want to hear what you guys think. Was Jamie really as innocent as he tried to make it all sound? Is it fair that his sentence was actually longer than Mark's? And why didn't the cops do more to save David when they were wiretapping the phones and knew Robert and John were planning to kill him? I barely touched on that because I had so much to go through, but it does feel like there were a lot of times where the police could have caught them much earlier, but they dropped the ball. I know this was a wild and complex case, and I think that's why so many of you have requested it, but I definitely want to know your thoughts, so leave them in the comment section below. And I can't emphasize this enough, guys, but until the next one, please stay safe. Bye.